Have you ever wondered how something slow, awkward, and nearly written off as obsolete could still change the fate of men in the sky? What kind of weapon could force trained American pilots, fresh from victories in North Africa, to suddenly feel hunted by a relic they believed belonged to the earliest years of the war? And how did the Ju-87 Stuka, the crooked-winged dive bomber with a reputation for being outdated and painfully vulnerable, become the hidden force behind a string of deadly surprises across 1943 and 1944? It was a machine built for one purpose: to strike with terrifying precision before its victims even understood what was happening. With fierce FW-190 escorts guarding its path, the Stuka could hit so violently that entire crews disappeared before they could react. To understand how this unlikely aircraft regained its bite, we must return to the moment American pilots first saw it reappear, slow, ugly, and somehow still deadly. The first months of fighting in North Africa created a pattern many American pilots grew comfortable with. They had crossed the Atlantic, expecting fierce, modern opponents. But what they met in late 1942 often felt scattered and weakened. German forces were stretched, airfields were temporary, and many aircraft appeared worn from earlier campaigns. The Ju-87 Stuka, once the terror of Europe, was rarely seen in the sky anymore. Reports claimed it was too slow, too easy to intercept, and too fragile for a battlefield now filled with faster fighters. Pilots joked that the Stuka belonged in a museum rather than on a combat mission. This belief slowly became routine thinking, shaping how crews planned their patrols and how commanders evaluated threats across the desert. Yet the vastness of North Africa had a way of creating strange gaps in knowledge. Dust storms erased visibility for days. Radio intercepts were often incomplete. Pilots moved constantly from one captured airstrip to another, building their understanding from short bursts of combat rather than a full picture. In that environment, it was easy for an old enemy to slip through unnoticed. The first hints arrived as scattered notes in squadron logs, records of sudden, sharp explosions hitting supply trucks near Forward Operating Base West, or a medical tent struck during dusk when all aircraft were believed to be grounded. Crews blamed leftover artillery or rogue reconnaissance planes, but the pattern seemed too precise to come from chance. Something was choosing its targets carefully, hitting fast, and disappearing into the open desert. When maintenance teams inspected the craters left behind, they noticed the shape of the impacts. The marks suggested steep-angle dives, the kind associated with dive bombers rather than level bombers, that created an unsettling thought. If a dive bomber was active, then whoever flew it was confident enough to attack under the noses of Allied fighters. Rumors spread slowly at first. Some said the Luftwaffe was testing a new aircraft. Others guessed it was a captured Allied plane turned against its former owners. The idea of the Stuka reappearing felt too unlikely for most to consider seriously. To many Americans, the Stuka had been defeated during the Battle of Britain, its weakness exposed for all to see. It no longer fit the image of a modern threat. Still, the desert kept revealing new traces. A patrol sweeping near the Marath region found burned jeep wrecks positioned in a straight line, each one hit by a single bomb. Farther west, an armor column reported hearing the distant wail of something diving from above, followed by precise impacts spaced like stones falling from the same hand. Pilots wondered why these attacks never appeared during the day when patrols dominated the sky. The answer slowly emerged from captured German documents. Certain Luftwaffe units had moved Stuka groups deeper into the interior, flying at low altitude and using rugged ground crews who could operate from almost nothing. These groups waited patiently for opportunities, attacking when Allied patrols were refueling or when dust storms shielded them from view. A turning point arrived in early 1943 when a reconnaissance flight returning from the Kasserine region spotted an aircraft silhouette that looked far too angular to be anything modern. The pilot described wings bent in a distinctive inverted gull shape, a detail impossible to confuse with any Allied design. The Stuka had not vanished. It had adapted. Instead of breaking under pressure, it had slipped into the cracks of the battlefield and learned to survive by staying low, striking quickly, and choosing times when no one expected an attack. Understanding this shift required looking deeper into how the aircraft functioned. The Stuka was never meant to compete with fast fighters. Its strength came from stability during steep dives, allowing its pilot to aim a bomb, almost as if pointing a finger at the target. Its engines lacked speed, but its airframe handled punishment well. It could lift off from rough strips where most Allied planes could never operate. All of these qualities made it perfect for the kind of ambushes appearing across North Africa. The Americans had assumed speed defined danger, but the Stuka measured danger differently. Precision mattered more than agility, and the battlefield in North Africa, wide, open, and filled with isolated targets, favored this kind of accuracy. The first full encounter came not from a pilot expecting combat, but from one performing a routine patrol near Tebessa. As he scanned the horizon, he noticed the odd shape of dust, clouds rising below. Those clouds were not random. They formed a narrow line, spaced almost evenly apart. When he descended for a closer look, he saw trucks in flames and the flat desert marked with fresh bomb craters. The Stuka that caused it was already gone, vanishing behind a stretch of rocky ridges before Allied fighters reached the area. This moment forced American squadrons to reconsider their assumptions. If a Stuka could slip through once, it could slip through again. The aircraft's slow speed was no longer a weakness if it attacked when no one was there to stop it. Commanders began ordering more patrols at dawn and dusk. Radar crews monitored unusual flight patterns along the edges of German territory. Every new briefing included a reminder that even outdated weapons could be lethal under the right conditions. As the truth became harder to ignore, tension grew across forward bases. Pilots who once dismissed the Stuka as harmless now listened carefully for faint engine sounds during their rest periods. Ground crews added sandbags around fuel trucks. Mechanics checked aircraft faster, worried that every delay created a window for a sudden dive bomb attack. The Stuka had returned, not as a dominant force, but as an unpredictable shadow capable of striking wherever attention grew thin. This atmosphere of uncertainty laid the foundation for what came next. The Americans soon discovered that the Stuka was not returning alone, and the surprise waiting over Tunisia would change the way they fought for the rest of the campaign. The first signs that something larger was unfolding came in the weeks after the Stuka's unexpected return. American pilots flying near the Tunisian front noticed small changes that did not match earlier Luftwaffe behavior. Enemy patrols seemed more coordinated, appearing in places where airspace had been quiet for days. Radar operators began spotting brief, low-altitude blips that faded almost as soon as they appeared. Supply convoys reported aircraft shadows passing over them in the early morning haze. It felt as if the enemy had become more alert, more careful, and more unpredictable. What no one realized yet was that the Luftwaffe was adjusting its tactics not just to protect something old, but to rebuild a lost threat from the ground up. In the first months of 1943, Allied air superiority over Tunisia looked solid on paper. Fighter groups flew frequent patrols. Airfields were expanding. Crews believed German aviation was shrinking under pressure from fuel shortages and constant relocation. That confidence slowly developed into routine complacency, a belief that enemy fighters would rarely commit to deep, aggressive defense of isolated bomber groups, especially old ones like the Stuka. But the Germans were not operating alone anymore. They had quietly moved new fighter detachments into range units, equipped with the FW-190, one of the most dangerous fighters still available to the shrinking Luftwaffe. The introduction of the FW-190 into the region changed the balance far more than American pilots expected. This aircraft climbed quickly, dove hard, and carried a sharp mix of cannon and machine gun fire. Its broad wings allowed strong control during low-level maneuvers, while the Messerschmitt Bf-109 relied on altitude and speed. The FW-190 excelled close to the ground, exactly where the Stuka needed protection. The Germans had created a partnership. A slow, precise dive bomber, shielded by a fast, aggressive escort that thrived in the same environment. In the wide stretches of Tunisia, this combination proved more effective than anyone on the Allied side anticipated. The first major encounter came when an American patrol near the town of Fade spotted a formation of aircraft flying low over the desert floor. The pilots believed they had found a fragile group of Stukas moving between temporary landing strips. They descended confidently, expecting to catch them undefended. What happened next opened a new chapter in the campaign. Without warning, shapes burst upward from behind a line of rocky hills, sleek, compact fighters rising into the path of the attacking Americans. The patrol tried to break away, but the FW-190 fighters surged forward with surprising speed, forcing the Americans to defend themselves instead of chasing the slow bombers. The Stukas continued their path undisturbed, almost as if the entire maneuver had been rehearsed in advance. When the surviving Americans returned to base, the tension in their debriefing room was thick enough to feel. The Stuka was no longer a lone, outdated machine wandering through the desert. It now traveled under the wing of one of the Luftwaffe's most capable fighters. The idea that a formation of slow bombers could be a trap rather than an opportunity changed how pilots viewed every shape on the horizon. Even the simplest silhouette could hide a dangerous escort waiting just beyond sight. As reports of these coordinated attacks increased, intelligence officers reviewed captured documents and pieced together a broader pattern. The Luftwaffe had reorganized parts of its air groups to focus entirely on low-level operations. They created what amounted to mobile strike teams, Stukas, flying below the radar, while FW-190 fighters hovered above them or hid behind terrain features. These teams waited for openings, supply convoys without escort, armor columns stuck in soft sand, or American patrols stretched thin across distant sectors. The Stuka performed the strike, and the FW-190 punished anyone who tried to interfere. The effect on American planning was immediate. Squadrons began flying higher, hoping to avoid ambushes near the ground. Patrol areas were widened, and groups were encouraged to stay in pairs or larger formations rather than breaking apart. Higher patrols made it harder to spot low-flying Stukas, and wider areas left gaps in coverage. Commanders found themselves in a difficult situation, protecting the sky while trying not to fall into traps laid by enemy fighters who understood the terrain far better. What unsettled pilots most was how confidently the enemy flew. The Stukas no longer behaved like isolated survivors left behind by a fading air force. They appeared at vulnerable moments during refueling, while escorting ground troops, or when convoys paused to reorganize. The FW-190 fighters seemed to anticipate where American planes would react, taking advantage of every delay or hesitation. It became clear that the Germans had spent weeks studying Allied habits and timing their operations precisely. Instead, they positioned themselves between American patrols and the Stuka's flight path. By the time the Allies approached firing range, the Stuka had already dropped its bombs and disappeared toward the mountains. The FW-190 fighters would then peel away, preserving their strength for the next mission. This restraint made them even more dangerous, because it meant they were flying with intent rather than desperation. On the ground, the results were painful. Engineers repairing roads near Spaetla watched as Stuka dives shattered equipment before any fighter escort could respond. A fuel depot near Gafsa lost several storage tanks during an attack coordinated so tightly that the escort fighters engaged the Allied interceptors moments before the bombs struck. The Americans found themselves fighting not just an aircraft, but an evolving strategy that exploited every weakness in their coverage. As frustration grew, so did the realization that the Stuka had regained relevance not through its own strength, but through the support it received. The FW-190 turned the skies into a layered battlefield where slow and fast aircraft complemented each other perfectly. American pilots felt the pressure of this shift every time they took off, never knowing whether the next low-flying shape would be a simple target or the start of an ambush. This rising tension set the stage for a new kind of threat, one that would reveal itself fully once the campaign crossed into the Mediterranean and Sicily, where the Germans would refine their tactics further and force the Allies into some of the most difficult air battles of the war. As the fighting in Tunisia intensified, the Stuka's new role became unmistakable. It was no longer a symbol of early war dominance fading into history. Instead, it began to function like a precision tool, striking exactly where Allied troops were stretched thin or forced into narrow, exposed valleys. Each attack created the same unsettling pattern: a sudden engine howl from low altitude, a steep dive hidden behind dust or terrain, and a string of impacts that felt carefully measured rather than chaotic. What made these strikes truly dangerous was the timing. They often happened when American units were already under pressure from ground forces, adding another layer of shock to moments when attention was divided. This shift in Luftwaffe tactics became more apparent as the terrain changed. Tunisia offered rocky ridges, low hills, and shallow depressions that allowed aircraft to fly low enough to remain unseen until the final seconds of an attack. Instead of racing across the sky, it moved steadily, hugging the contours of the land. Its pilots understood how to use shadows, wind direction, and the natural shape of the desert to mask their approach. Many American troops described the same experience. One moment the sky seemed empty, and the next moment bombs were falling with frightening accuracy. American pilots faced their own difficulties. Low-altitude combat demanded constant attention, and chasing the Stuka into the valleys meant flying into the territory where the FW-190 was strongest. The Luftwaffe had shaped the battlefield in a way that forced American aircraft to choose between two risks: allow the Stuka to complete its dive or descend into a trap. This dilemma eroded confidence among many patrols. They knew that descending too quickly or committing too early could invite disaster. On the ground, commanders observed how the Stuka's presence affected the movement of entire columns. Supply vehicles slowed their pace when entering open ground. Artillery units spread out more widely to reduce the damage of a concentrated hit. Infantry often paused during critical advances because the sound of distant engines triggered automatic caution even when the aircraft were miles away. The fear came not from the aircraft's appearance, but from the precision of its attacks. It hit what it wanted to hit, and troops respected that deadly efficiency. Tanks, usually symbols of security and strength, became major targets. In several clashes near the mountain passes west of Kairouan, American tank crews watched as Stukas descended at steep angles, dropping armor-piercing bombs that punched through turrets and engine compartments. The slow approach of the dive bomber made the attack even more stressful. Crews felt as if they were being hunted one vehicle at a time. Even tanks that survived the blast suffered broken tracks or damaged optics, leaving them stranded until recovery teams could arrive. Every attack revealed another challenge. The Stuka seemed to appear whenever the Americans believed the skies were safe. This pattern created suspicion that the Luftwaffe had improved its intelligence capabilities. Later analysis would show that German ground observers, radio intercept teams, and forward operating units all coordinated to identify precise moments when Allied aircraft were least active. It was a simple but highly effective system. The Stuka did not have to defeat American fighters directly. It only had to strike during the brief windows when the sky was clear. As these attacks continued, American pilots began developing new techniques to counter the threat. They flew wider loops during patrols, extended their observation arcs, and coordinated with radar stations positioned along newly secured areas. Yet despite these efforts, the Stuka continued to score hits at surprising times. The presence of FW-190 escorts meant the Americans could not commit all their energy to interception. They had to stay alert for ambushes, draining their attention across multiple layers of the battlefield. The psychological effect of the Stuka returned in full force. Veterans who had studied early reports from Europe recognized the description of its sirens, those mechanical devices that produced a rising howl during steep dives. Although many Stuka units had removed the sirens earlier in the war, some in Tunisia still used them. The sound echoed across valleys, carrying over sand dunes and ridgelines, creating a chilling moment of anticipation before the bombs hit. For troops pinned down under fire, the wail became a warning of destruction they could do little to avoid. Even units not directly attacked reported losing time to caution whenever the sound reached their position. As spring approached, the Stuka's presence shaped Allied planning more than expected. American troops learned to read the landscape differently, scanning for possible approach paths when entering new sectors. Patrols adjusted altitude more frequently to maintain visibility over ridges. Ground units requested more coordination between anti-aircraft guns and forward observers. Yet despite these improvements, the Stuka continued to maintain its effectiveness due to the protection provided by its fighter escorts. The low-altitude environment remained a lethal place for isolated American aircraft, especially when FW-190 fighters patrolled just above the horizon. The Luftwaffe's strategy created a sense of inevitability. Every convoy, every artillery position, every advance across open desert felt exposed to the possibility of a sudden strike. The Americans realized that they were not facing a weakened enemy, struggling to remain relevant. They were facing an enemy that understood how to reshape old tools into new threats. The Stuka had become less of an aircraft and more of a signal, a reminder that the Luftwaffe could still influence the ground, fight even under overwhelming pressure. By the time the campaign in North Africa neared its end, the stage was set for a new phase of conflict. The Allies were preparing to carry their momentum into the Mediterranean. Troops expected a difficult fight on the next front, but many hoped the Stuka's influence would fade as the battle moved across the sea. What awaited them in Sicily and later Italy would prove those hopes wrong. The Luftwaffe had not finished refining its tactics. The Stuka still had strength left, and its most destructive moments were yet to come. When the North African campaign finally ended, many American units believed the worst of the Stuka threat had passed. The Luftwaffe had lost airfields, supply lines, fuel, and the freedom to move large formations. Commanders hoped that the next stage of the war, crossing the Mediterranean and landing on the island of Sicily, would reduce the opportunities for dive bombers to strike. The open sea seemed like a safer space, a place where air patrols could respond faster and where ships could provide overlapping anti-aircraft fire. But once again, the assumptions made on paper did not match the conditions waiting in the field. The Stuka, supported by the same aggressive FW-190 escorts, was preparing to deliver some of its most effective attacks of the war. As the Allied invasion fleet approached Sicily in early July of 1943, the conditions were ideal for aerial ambushes. Long convoys stretched across miles of open water, and the slow movement of landing craft created predictable patterns. Even with strong naval guns and fighter patrols, there were moments when the ships had to commit to careful maneuvers through narrow approaches. The Luftwaffe understood these vulnerabilities well, and the Stuka units positioned along the southern Italian coast waited for the right opportunity. Their low-level training in Tunisia served them perfectly here. The aircraft could fly close to the waves, hiding beneath radar and disappearing against the horizon until the moment they climbed for a dive. The first major attack began just as waves of infantry were closing in on the beaches. Many soldiers were focused on the shoreline ahead, watching smoke rise from artillery fire and trying to identify German defensive positions. Naval crews reacted quickly, firing bursts of anti-aircraft shells that exploded in thick black clouds. But the Stukas moved methodically, shifting into position and falling toward their targets with practiced precision. Others targeted destroyers that were turning sharply to avoid underwater hazards. American pilots scrambled to push back, but the same problem from Tunisia returned in an even more intense form. FW-190 escorts waited above and behind the Stuka formations, appearing only when the Americans committed to interception. The escorts forced Allied fighters to engage at awkward angles, pulling them away from the dive bombers. Each time an American patrol attempted to attack the Stukas directly, the escorts struck with speed and accuracy. This created a chaotic environment in the sky, where aircraft from both sides collided with shifting priorities. Fighters had to protect themselves, protect the fleet, and prevent the dive bombers from reaching their targets, all under the pressure of constant movement and limited altitude. On the beaches, the impact of the Stuka's precision was unmistakable. Tanks, trying to move inland, were hit before they could spread out. Ammunition piles burst into flames when bombs struck too close. Engineers building pathways for vehicles often found themselves under sudden attack, dropping equipment and diving for cover as the scream of falling aircraft cut through the noise of battle. The Stuka's ability to pick targets that slowed the overall advance created delays that rippled across the entire operation. Each time a key vehicle was destroyed or a beach sector became too dangerous, momentum was lost. One of the most difficult lessons came when American pilots discovered that chasing Stukas too aggressively over land carried new risks. Sicily's rugged interior filled with ridges, dry riverbeds, and old stone villages gave the Luftwaffe natural hiding places. Stukas often pulled out of their dives and disappeared behind terrain features before American fighters could follow. When Allied aircraft attempted to keep up, they found themselves exposed to FW-190 fighters waiting on the other side of the ridge. The ambush pattern that had begun in Tunisia now appeared in a more refined form. The battlefield had become a three-dimensional trap designed to punish overconfidence. As the fighting continued inland, the Luftwaffe changed its focus. Instead of striking only at the front lines, Stukas began attacking supply routes, winding through narrow mountain paths. Trucks carrying food, ammunition, and medical supplies had little room to maneuver on the uneven roads. A single bomb could block an entire column, leaving units ahead without support. American troops marching through the heat often had to halt for hours while engineers cleared debris or rebuilt broken sections of road. Each interruption gave German forces more time to reorganize defenses deeper into the island. Despite these setbacks, American pilots adapted quickly. They learned to coordinate their patrols in layers, creating overlapping coverage that made it harder for Stukas to fly undetected. Naval ships adjusted their formations, spreading out to reduce the chance of multiple hits from a single dive-bombing run. Anti-aircraft crews improved their timing, firing earlier and forcing Stukas to pull out sooner than planned. These changes did not remove the threat, but they reduced its effectiveness. Stuka losses increased, especially when pilots misjudged the angle of their dives or flew too close to concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Many American infantry units described the fear that spread during the quiet moments between attacks. The sound of distant engines, sometimes real, sometimes imagined, was enough to make entire squads pause during their advance. The memory of Tunisia resurfaced, reminding troops that slow aircraft could still bring fast destruction. The Stuka had once again proven that its reputation from the early years of the war had not fully faded. By the time Sicily was secured, American commanders understood that the Stuka threat was far from over. The Luftwaffe had shown that even a declining force could deliver painful blows by relying on knowledge of terrain, aggressive escorts, and perfect timing. When the Allies crossed from Sicily onto the Italian mainland, many expected the Stuka to fade from the war. The Luftwaffe was losing fuel, spare parts, and trained pilots. German airfields were under constant pressure from Allied bombers. The terrain was harsh, and every retreat forced German units to abandon equipment they could not carry. On paper, the Stuka's days seemed numbered, but the reality on the ground and in the air was very different. Italy's long, mountainous spine and narrow coastal plains created perfect conditions for low-altitude attacks. The Stuka, despite its age, found new life among the ridges and valleys where radar coverage was weak and Allied patrols struggled to maneuver. The first signs of renewed danger came during the advance north from Salerno in late 1943. Convoys moving along the winding coastal roads suddenly came under attack from aircraft diving out of shadows cast by steep cliffs. Many of these strikes followed a predictable rhythm, a faint engine sound blending with the wind, a rapid drop in altitude, and a bomb landing within yards of a vehicle trying to navigate tight turns. Troops learned quickly that Italy's geography favored the Stuka style of attack. The aircraft could fly low along the coast, disappear behind a ridge, and appear seconds later directly above a vulnerable column. Chasing the Stuka in this terrain meant flying close to rock walls, narrow passes, and valleys where escape routes were limited. The FW-190 escorts adapted easily to this environment. Instead of waiting in open sky, they used the terrain to hide before launching sudden counterattacks. Allied pilots often had only moments to react before finding themselves targeted by escorts rising from behind hillsides. This pattern created a sense that the Luftwaffe had blended into the land itself. striking from places where patrols hesitated to fly. On the ground, the Stuka's persistence created major delays. Engineers clearing landslides caused by rain or shellfire worked under constant risk of a sudden strike. Artillery units attempting to reposition their guns needed extra time to scout for signs of enemy aircraft. Even simple movements, such as trucks delivering rations, became difficult when a single bomb could block an entire road carved into a cliffside. Every hit forced units to wait for repairs or reroute through smaller paths that slowed the advance even further. The Stuka's goal had shifted from breaking entire divisions to disrupting the flow of supplies and movement. And in Italy's narrow corridors, that strategy worked. One of the most dramatic moments occurred during operations near the town of Venafro. American tanks moving through a valley believed they were protected by patrols circling high above. But the Stuka approached from a direction few expected, a small pass hidden between two mountains. It descended almost vertically, using the tight terrain to mask its angle until the final seconds. When American air support arrived, the WWII fighters swept in from the opposite side of the valley, forcing the patrols into defensive maneuvers. The Stuka had turned the landscape into a weapon, using Italy's geography to compensate for its aging design. Despite these challenges, American pilots continued to learn. They adapted patrol patterns to match the terrain, creating overlapping routes that covered valleys from multiple angles. Larger formations flew together more often, reducing the chance of isolated ambushes. Radar stations moved forward whenever possible, improving early warning across the front. These changes slowly reduced the Stuka's freedom to operate, but they did not eliminate it. The aircraft remained a threat because it did not need complete control of the sky. It only needed a few seconds of opportunity, supported by escorts willing to fight aggressively. As the Allies pushed toward Monte Cassino in early 1944, the Stuka appeared again, this time focusing on supply hubs and artillery positioned in open fields. The terrain around the valley allowed the Stuka to approach at extremely low altitude, flying just above the treetops or following the curves of the river. Many attacks took place during early morning or late afternoon, when visibility changed quickly and shadows stretched across the ground. Troops described how the aircraft seemed to rise out of the light itself, diving before anyone could identify its approach path. By this stage of the war, the Stuka was aging rapidly. Many units struggled with maintenance, and crews worked long hours to keep aircraft flying. But the Luftwaffe used what it had with determination. Even a handful of dive bombers could disrupt a carefully planned offensive. The Americans learned this repeatedly. Ammunition depots near the front faced frequent attacks. Field hospitals came under unexpected strikes when the Luftwaffe suspected the presence of senior officers nearby. Bridges rebuilt after heavy rains were hit before vehicles could cross them. Every delay created pressure on American commanders to adjust their timelines. The psychological effect of the Stuka remained powerful even without its famous sirens. The knowledge that an outdated aircraft, one everyone assumed was finished, could still deliver accurate and deadly attacks left a strong impression on both pilots and ground troops. It reminded them that war was not simply a contest of modern machines, but a struggle shaped by timing, terrain, and the ability to adapt. The Stuka endured because its role fit the landscape, and because its escorts protected it with fierce commitment. By the time Allied forces reached the outskirts of Rome in mid-1944, the Stuka was beginning to show the limits of its endurance. Losses increased, fuel shortages worsened, and German retreat paths narrowed. Yet even in decline, the aircraft continued to strike at critical moments. It refused to disappear quietly, forcing the Americans to treat every low-flying Echo as a potential threat. By the summer of 1944, the Stuka was fighting a losing battle. The Luftwaffe was shrinking in every direction. Fuel shortages forced strict rationing, spare parts were difficult to find, and many experienced pilots had been lost in earlier campaigns. Airfields across Italy were abandoned one after another as German forces retreated north. Yet even with these problems, the Stuka did not disappear. It continued to appear in the least expected moments, striking at isolated columns, mountain passes, field hospitals, and artillery positions. Its presence felt almost symbolic, an echo of the early war returning in a different form. The Allies had overwhelming control of the sky, but they still could not ignore the shape of a dive bomber dropping out of the sun. The final chapters of the Stukas story unfolded as the Allies pushed north toward Florence and the Gothic Line. Italy's mountains grew taller, the valleys narrower, and the weather more unpredictable. These conditions, while difficult for any air force, gave the Stuka one last environment where its strengths mattered. It could still pick targets with care, and with even a few operational FW-190 escorts, it could still force American patrols to hesitate before diving into the valleys where ambushes waited. Every mission became a gamble for both sides, shaped by the narrow margins of time, distance, and fuel. One of the Stuka's last effective roles was attacking bridges and temporary crossings built by engineers under constant pressure. The retreating German army relied on destroying these structures to delay the Allied advance, and the Stuka proved useful for this purpose. Many of the strikes occurred at dawn, when fog drifted up from the rivers and covered the spans in thin layers of mist. Crews waiting to cross watched the fog shift in the shifting light, unsure if the shapes moving inside it were Allied aircraft or something else. When a Stuka descended from the fog and dropped a bomb directly on the wooden planks laid across the current, the result could stop an entire battalion from moving forward. Even if the crossing was not destroyed, the shock of the attack forced engineers to halt their work until patrols confirmed the sky was clear. American air superiority grew stronger each week, but this superiority did not remove the Stuka's last advantages. The Allies controlled the open sky, but the Germans controlled pockets of terrain where radar did not reach. The Stuka slipped into these pockets, appearing in places where American pilots believed the threat was weak. The aircraft did not need to win a battle. It only needed to survive long enough to land a hit. Many Stuka missions in 1944 ended with the aircraft diving into valleys, releasing a single bomb, and then climbing toward a narrow route that led back to a hidden landing strip. Sometimes it escaped. Sometimes it did not. But each attempt carried the same impact. A reminder that the battlefield was not defined only by the fastest or newest machines. As autumn approached, the Luftwaffe situation became desperate. Each surviving Stuka required careful maintenance that ground crews could barely sustain. Cannibalizing parts from damaged aircraft became normal practice. Pilots trained for dive bombing years earlier were now flying missions on aircraft patched together from whatever the crews could find. Still, the Stuka flew. Some missions were small, 1 or 2 aircraft diving on a single target before withdrawing. Others were even smaller, 1 lone Stuka, attempting to disrupt an artillery battery positioned in a clearing. These missions rarely changed the outcome of the war, but they forced the Americans to stay alert and commit resources to defense. Troops who heard the rising whistle of a diving aircraft felt a rush of instinctive fear. Even if the aircraft was several miles away or belonged to an Allied unit, the Stuka had created a signature feeling, a reaction built from years of battlefield stories and first-hand experiences. Its ability to strike with precision, even in small numbers, shaped how American units moved and planned their routes. They learned to avoid parking vehicles in tight groups, even during rest periods. They built more camouflage nets over supply dumps. They created decoy positions at night to draw enemy attention. These behaviors were not just responses to active threats. They were habits formed from the memory of what the Stuka had done earlier in the campaign. By the end of 1944, the Stuka's role was nearly over. German retreat lines forced even the remaining dive bomber units to abandon airfields too close to the front. Winter storms grounded many aircraft for days at a time. Allied patrols filled the sky in layers, leaving little room for old aircraft to climb safely. When fuel shortages became severe, some Stuka units were ordered to use their remaining aircraft only for reconnaissance or emergency missions. The once feared dive bomber that had shaped the early years of the war was now reduced to scattered remnants struggling to stay airborne. Yet even in decline, the Stuka made its presence felt. A few final missions struck vehicles near the Apennine passes. A handful of late attacks hit artillery, moving into position for the next offensive. these strikes had little strategic impact, but they reinforced a lasting truth. An outdated weapon is still dangerous if used with skill, timing, and determination. Many American pilots who fought in Italy later admitted that underestimating the Stuka had been a mistake. Its slow speed hid its ability to strike with accuracy. Its old design hid its adaptability, and its weakness hid the strength of the pilots who flew it with stubborn resolve. The Stuka's story in Italy ended not with a dramatic final battle, but with exhaustion. The aircraft simply could not survive in a war dominated by faster fighters, stronger defenses, and overwhelming Allied numbers. The Americans learned a difficult lesson that shaped their understanding of air combat for the rest of the war. Nothing is harmless if it can still kill you. The Stuka proved that even the slowest and ugliest machine could remain a threat when paired with the right tactics and flown by men who refused to let it die.